How's it going, everybody? In this mini lecture video, we are going to be talking about one of the many critical approaches that you can take when you are analyzing a piece of literature, critical race theory. So here we have a photo of one of the sort of most major writers in the development of critical race theory. This is W.E.B. Du Bois. So, as far as a general overview of what are we talking about when we're talking about, what is critical race theory, what is it trying to do? What it really does is examines the appearance of race and racism across the dominant cultural modes of expression in an attempt to understand systemic racism and how the cultural perceptions of race affect the victims of this systemic racism. So, it really looks at how race and racism plays into pretty much every layer of the dominant culture in America. And it draws really heavily from a lot of different fields, such as philosophy, history, sociology, and law. Really, again, focusing in on the sort of the real world perceptions of race and racism and systemic racism. It recognizes that racism is an everyday element of American life. It's again, it is just a thing that happens everywhere, pretty much all the time, consciously or unconsciously. It's just kind of baked into American life. Critical race theory emphasizes intersectionality, which is something that a number of other theories do really kind of try to emphasize as well. But again, it's this intersectionality theory acknowledges that we have multiple identities and our participation in one cultural group, our membership in one cultural group doesn't define our existence purely in that way. For instance, despite being women, a white woman and a black woman are going to have very different experiences because of that intersection of race and gender. So critical race theory also seeks tangible real world ends through the work that these theorists and these scholars are performing. So a lot of writing done in sort of the lens of critical race theory has a very like social activist kind of stance, really trying to actually affect real world change. So a lot of early critical race theory writing really focuses on the experiences of Black Americans, but a lot of scholars have also started expanding their questions out to deal with various other racialized groups. Asian Americans, Latinx Americans, Indian Americans. Basically the list goes on and on and on. But a lot of the questions that scholars in these various kind of offshoots of critical race theory are asking are all very similar. They ask things like, what is the significance of race in contemporary American society? Where and in what ways and to what ends does race appear in dominant American culture? And does it shape the way that we interact with one another? What types of texts and cultural artifacts reflect the dominant culture's perception of race? How can scholars convey that racism is a concern that affects all members of society? So, I think this really kind of ties back to that, socially activist stance here. How can we show that this is, that racism is a problem? It is an everyday element of our life. How can we show people? How can we, convince people that this is a thing, that this is a problem? How does racism continue to function as a persistent force in American society? And how can we combat racism to ensure that all members of American society experience equal representation and access to fundamental rights? Again, really placing a really heavy emphasis not just on theory here, but on getting something actually getting something accomplished. And then finally, how can we accurately reflect the experience of victims of racism? So instead of essentializing, or instead of making something look better than it actually was, how can we be true and be accurate? So as far as just a few common terms that we see when we are talking about race and racism and critical race theory, you may have heard the term white privilege before. This refers to the various social, political, and economic advantages that people who are white have based on their racial membership. It's just it's not I don't know, a key to the kingdom or anything like that. It's not a guarantee of success, but it's not having to worry about a few things. For instance, like I know as a white person that I'm probably never going to be asked for, citizenship documentation if I'm within 100 miles of the US border. That's just something that I don't have to worry about, that people who don't look like me probably would have to worry about. Other important terms, microaggressions. These are seemingly minute, often unconscious instances of prejudice that they just kind of build up. These are those tiny little things, the slightly offensive comment that we maybe even didn't realize was offensive. But they build up, and they collectively, over time, they contribute to racism, and they contribute to the subordination of racialized individuals. Institutionalized racism, this is also systemic racism is kind of an interchangeable term here. These are the ways in which our culture, our dominant society, has been set up to restrict racialized individuals or groups' access to opportunities. So this is processes like redlining, where banks literally took a red pen and drew an area, circled like a neighborhood around a map, and said, you know what, we're not going to invest here. Those neighborhoods that they drew the red lines around were almost always populated primarily by Black Americans. This is that systemic way in which these things happen. Social construction speaks to the fact that our understanding of race it's a product of social thought and relationships. It is a made up thing that attempts to explain some sort of biological or genetic differences, but those biological or genetic differences don't actually exist. There is, to get really corny here, when it comes down to it, there's one race, the things that we think of are as racialized differences are just they're just like differences in melanin levels in our skin. There's nothing actually different there. And then again, to revisit intersectionality and anti-essentialism, it's basically just the notion that one aspect of our identity does not necessarily determine the other ways that we experience things. Intersectionality theory really is super important to understanding the way that we move through the world, because different aspects of our identity are going to shape our experiences in different ways depending on the situation. And there's all kinds of different stuff as far as that is concerned. So that is all for this video. Thank you very much, and I will see you all in the next one.